بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on the path of piety, in which we're looking at one of the great works of the Ottoman period, the Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya of Imam al-Birgivi rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, we have reached the section on beliefs, right? The section on beliefs. And in the section on beliefs, we began last lesson by looking at an introduction to this, to beliefs and what is understood as being mainstream beliefs, right? And what's the meaning of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and the significance of the existence of Ahl Sunnah as this reality, right? And this reality that is integral to the preservation of the deen. And he begins by saying that, the summary of this belief, it begins of course with the issue, with mabhath of tawheed, of divine oneness. And divine oneness, we looked at the relationship between Allah's being wahid and His being ahad, right? And even though His being ahad is more emphatic in some ways, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, right? But of course both have come in the Quran, right? قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, say He is Allah, the unique. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also tells us, وَإِلَهُكُمْ إِلَهٌ وَاحِدٌ, right? In Surah Al-Baqarah, right? And there's wisdoms why, multiple names are used to connote the meaning of oneness. And we took that this oneness is a negation of multiplicity, right? In Allah's entity, in His attributes, and in His actions, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we also touched upon the core proof, one of the core proofs of divine oneness, which is called Burhanu Tamanu', right? And those are discussed more extensively in detailed studies of Islamic beliefs, but the summary of it revolves around what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran: لَوْ كَانَ فِيهِمَا آلِهَةٌ إِلَّا اللَّهُ لَفَسَدَتَا. Had there been other gods for it besides Allah, the heavens and the earth would be corrupted, right? So, of course, this contains within it an implicit proof as well, right? Which is that creation needs a creator. The creator could be one or many, theoretically. If it were many, the world would not have existed. But the world does exist, so therefore it can only have one creator, right? So there's an implicit proof in it that creation requires a creator. But this is a claim that is affirmed without detailing. That's taken as a given, that creation requires a creator. Okay? But that's implicit. It's implicitly there. That creator, one could theoretically conceive of it being one or many. If it was more than one, the world could not have existed. But we've already dealt with the fact that it needs a creator, so therefore the creator could only be one. And being able to establish that clearly is part of the training of the science of Islamic beliefs. And we went into the issue of whether the Quranic proof is itself a decisive proof, or is the Quranic presentation of it convincing and pointing towards the decisive proof. And that we touched upon it a little bit. And so then he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, لا يشبهه شيء. Nothing resembles him. Right? Nothing whatsoever resembles him. Right? Right? لا يشبهه شيء. Nothing resembles him. Right? This is, the later scholars use the term al-mukhalafa lil-hawadith. Right? لا يشبهه شيء. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, ليس كمثله شيء. There is nothing whatsoever like unto him. And that verse, ليس كمثله شيء, it contains two negations. ليس, the kaf, so there is not, and there's a kaf which is of comparison, and the mithl which is for comparison. Of course, some things human address assumes the presence of an intellect. Right? So two negations equals an affirmation. Right? If you say he is not here, what are you affirming? He is here. So this is one of the issues with laysa kamithlihi shay'. So there's broadly, and Imam As-Sawi touches upon this in his commentary on Jawharat Tawheed, so does Imam Al-Bajuri, and they mention overall 4 to 6 main opinions are mentioned. Some went into many other opinions, because there's multiple theoretical possibilities of how it could be understood. Broadly, the two main meanings, one is that the kaf is za'ida. Right? The kaf is za'ida. So it's, the meaning is laysa mithlahu shay'. And the kaf, in terms of language, is extra. Ji'a bihi lit-ta'keed. And its role is emphasis. Right? The other interpretation, laysa kamithlihi shay', but the meaning is affirmed, there's absolutely nothing like unto him. Right? So the kaf is za'ida. It's not negation plus negation. Because your negation times negation is like, minus 5 times minus 7 equals plus 35, right? But here, it's not. That's one interpretation, that the kaf is za'ida, and this is very common in the Arabic language, and one of the reasons for it is emphasis. The other meaning here, laysa kamithlihi shay', that this is even more emphatic. There is nothing like the likeness of Allah. Right? Because it's not just that nothing compares to Allah, but nothing compares to the likeness of Allah. Right? And there's many shades of meaning in that, because that's even more distant, right? In comparison, right? That there's nothing else that compares to what's the likeness of Allah? It would have been a divine being. So nothing would compare to the likeness of Allah. Nothing shares the meaning of mithliyya, let alone for it to enter into comparison. Right? And but either way, what's understood from it is an absolute and encompassing negation of any meaning of comparison between the creation and the creator. That's why Imam Al-Tahawi in his Aqidah says, من أثبت لله معنى من معاني البشر فقد كفر. Right? So Al-Tahawi in his Aqidah, right, says, من أثبت لله معنى من معاني البشر فَقَدْ كَفَرْ. Right? Whoever affirms for Allah any meaning of the meanings of created things has committed an act of disbelief. Right? Of course, it doesn't mean that they're kafir. They're only deemed kafir if they affirm it and negate all, possible excuses. لا يشبهه شيء. Nothing whatsoever resembles him in any way whatsoever. Right? Because right? And that is because no point of comparison exists, as the commentator explains, because you can only compare two things that are from the same category or from the same type. Right? Right? Can you compare an orange and a car? No, unless you put them under some shared category. Right? Right? Like then, because otherwise there's no point of comparison. Right? And there's no point of comparison between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He is, in terms of His existence, He's wajib al-wujud, they're merely mumkin al-wujud, they're existent. So their existential categories are different. Allah subhanahu, any attribute that is affirmed for Allah is wajib, qadeem, mutlaq. Right? 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 Any attribute that is affirmed for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's why Shaykh Muhammad Sa'id al-Burhani in his Tariqa al-Mardiyya on the Hadiyya al-Ala'iyya, in the section on Aqeedah, mentions each of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We affirm 7 things for them. Every single one of His attributes exists. It's qadeem, baqi, it's eternal, everlasting, one, absolutely distinct, independent. Right? And then, 7th investigation is the specific ta'alluq of that, the specific relationship of that attribute. Like power, Allah's power, for example, relates to all possible things in bringing them from non-existence into existence. So these investigations, right? There's no point of comparison in any of this with respect to any attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this attribute of any created thing. Right? Because any created thing is dependent, originated, limited, right? Etc. So no point of comparison arises, right? So in reality, all that is shared between creation and the Creator when it comes to names is the name itself, for the purpose for us to be able to conceive of the divine attribute. So the fact that we say Zubair has knowledge and Allah has knowledge, there's no point of comparison there. Right? Okay. لا يشبهه شيء. ليس بجسم. Allah Most High is not a body. Right? Because a body is in need of its parts, and as the commentator says, وَالْإِحْتِيَاجِ دَلِيلُ الْإِمْكَانِ. Need is a proof of being merely possible. وَلَا عَرَض. And He is not an attribute. Allah Most High is not an attribute. Right? Because an attribute is in need of a place. And place is originated, so that which needs the possible is itself possible. Right? ليس بجسم ولا عرض. Right? And ولا جوهر, and He is not an essence. Right? Right? an essence is a singular thing. An essence is basically, simply put, it's a thing. Right? A jism, a body, is made up of things, of essences, right? So Jawhar is the conceptual unit of created things. But it's a conceptual unit, it's not a physical unit, right? So you say, oh, is it an atom? Is it what? No. Okay? And sometimes people get confused even in Western thought that what in the classical tradition, what's called atomism, they're not talking about atoms in the scientific sense. Right? They mean, that's why they define al-juz' alladhi la yatajazza. These are the conceptual essential building blocks from which everything is made, is built. Okay? Can there be an essence that is indivisible? That's an argument amongst the theologians, right? And some of the ulama took very firm stances one way or the other. Ultimately, it's not what's important to know that belief in God is not dependent on affirmation of al-juz' alladhi la yatajazza. Although some people went to some lengths about it. Anyways, wala jawhar, nor is he an essence. Wala musawwar, right? And he does not take any form, right? Because forms are originated, right? And this is min lawazim al-ajsam. These are from a form is from the characteristics of bodies. Bodies take up space. Space is created, so that which takes up space is created. So these are absurdities. Wala mutanahin, and he has no limit, right? Because limits are endpoints of space. So if you say Allah is on the throne, then you're establishing a limit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you're also affirming that He takes up space. And if it's created, then it all falls apart. ولا متحيز. التحيز هو أخذ الشيء قدرا من الفراغ الموهوم. تحيز, he does not take up any space, right? التحيز is, he does not take up any space. So he's not up, down, in front, sideways, all of these are ولا يطعم ولا يشرب. He does not eat nor does he drink, because these are all from the characteristics of originated things. لم يلد ولم يولد. He does not give birth nor is he born, right? Because if he gave birth, right, then that child would, God is the necessary existent, God is, the divine, the creator, etc. So if he had a child, it would share in those meanings of divinity. But the divine can only be one. So it would affirm an absurdity. Because if the child God, quote unquote, وَلِعَيْذُ بِاللَّهِ, were divine, then divinity is a quality of that which is necessary existent. But the originated could not be a necessary existent, and if it's not necessary existent, it could not be divine. So it would entail degrees of absurdity, and Surah Al-Ikhlas rattles the cage of these absurdities. I don't know if we have it as an on-demand or on tafsir of Surah Al-Ikhlas. Could you check? Because we have all the audio for it and everything. That's an important lesson that we did a while back. لم يلد ولم يولد, and he was not born, right? Because the divine is necessary. The divine God could only be necessary existent. If he was born to another, then he's originated, and the originated is merely possible. And if he was possible, the merely possible could not be the basis of the existence of other possibles. And then whoever gave birth to him would be God, but then you have the problem of multiplicity, and it's absurd. Now Fakhruddin al-Razi complains that he tried to explain the absurdity of there being multiple gods and of Trinity to some Christian priests. He said, but he found that they had, despite their claiming lengthy study, because they spend a lot of time studying in monasteries and so on, they always have, but they didn't have clear understanding, even of he said, the most basic of first principles. And one of the reasons even the most basic of first principles are sort of like put in the blender, so to speak, in Western thought, is ultimately what are you trying to prove using those first principles? Right? And that's where we have to be careful. Sometimes, we're reading from these old books and these old prints, and what do we have in English, about Islam is disappointing at best, etc. So people look, there's entire Catholic seminaries and billions being spent on this and all kinds of publications. You go into academia, there's all these books about the existence of God. But hold on a second. And ultimately, what are they trying to prove? Firstly, why did intelligent people leave the faith anyways? Because what they're leaving, we would sympathize what the atheists are leaving. Right? Because it's like this, there's this Egyptian brother, when I was at university, it's really cool. It's like October, so winter's not really begun. He's wearing one of those Canada Goose things on the street and bundled up, and it's like still like it's not hit zero yet. It's not snow. It's October. He says cold, and it wasn't. It got to November. It got really cold. I said, "How is it?" He says, "Mumtaz, giddan, giddan, giddan." I said, "Why?" He says, "Every woman wearing hijab." Right? Because it's cold, everyone's bundled up, right? But he was really keen to be at our MSA table. They used to call it the da'wah table. I said, that's not da'wah. Someone came and said, I don't believe in God. So he said, I don't believe in the God that you don't believe in. But I believe in a God that you don't know about. Person, what? He says, you don't believe in God. The God you don't believe in, I don't believe in. But I believe in a God you don't know about. Do you understand? He says, could you explain? I said, okay, sit down. And they sat down. Right? Because the God that the atheists deny, we don't believe in either. Because that God could not exist. The notion of Trinity is a rational absurdity. Right? It does not and cannot exist. So the fact that intelligent people would leave belief in a notion of divinity that is rationally absurd is inevitable. But we also have to be aware that then an intellectual tradition built around, ultimately, what are you trying to prove? Right? It's not an abstract intellectual tradition. The conclusions of Christian philosophers, etc., get you to what? What are they trying to get to? And of course, they may only take you to a certain point and say, okay, therefore believe in, join the church, basically. Believe in what we believe. But the jump is, that's why they'll keep it in the abstract. Many Muslims will find it appealing, whatever, and it seems sophisticated. But part of the reason it's clouded up so much is because what they're trying to prove is inherently problematic. So you have to be very careful about many of those arguments because they come loaded with issues and with baggage that we would not accept. Right? Not that we won't accept, reality does not accept it. Right? Just be aware of that. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. And there is none whatsoever like unto him, either in type or category, etc. وَلَا يَتَمَكَّنْ بِمَكَانٍ. And he is not in any place. These are statements for emphasis. Right? وَلَا يَجْرِي عَلَيْهِ زَمَانٍ, and time does not pass over him. Allahu khaliqu الزَّمَانِ وَالْمَكَانِ, Allah is the creator of both time and place. Right? And the philosophers and the theologians had extensive discussions on what is meant by time. Right? And because time is a mutajaddid يقدر به متجدد آخر, is something that is constantly renewed. It's a succession of moments by which something else that is constantly renewed is measured. Right? So it is inherently the characteristic of originated things. It's a relative relationship between practically the movement of originated things. But Allah is not originated. So time does not relate to Him. Time and space are like the wi'a, or the envelope, the dharf of al-wujud al-hadith. Right? They're like the envelope, the bubble in which possible existence exists. Neither time nor space relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in any way whatsoever. So of course, then when we say Allah is eternal, He's qadim, and He's baqi, right? Some say He's pre-eternal and post-eternal, ancient without beginning, eternal without end. They say both of these, and Shaykh Abdul Ghani Nabulsi here in his Sharh on the Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya, I believe it's there. He quotes it also. He quotes Ayn al-Qudat al-Hamadani, one of the great Imams of the spiritual path. But it's a reality the theologians affirm as well, when you say that time does not relate to him, that, and this is quoted by Shaykh al-Burhani, either in, I think in his Taliqat on the, it might be on Nahlawi, but it's a precious insight. He mentions very explicitly, and Shaykh Abdul Ghani mentions it elsewhere as well. So when you say Allah is qadim and baqi, right, that these are affirming for us two of the consequential realities of the fact that Allah exists beyond time. That Allah's existence that does not relate to time, and time in no way conditions Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence. Allahu khaliqul zaman kama annahu khaliqul makan. Allah is the creator of time just as He is the creator of space. So time does not relate to Him. In that sense, Allah's being qadim, ancient, qadimun, like the way Tahawi puts it, qadimun bil ibtida, daimun bil intiha, la yafna wa la yabid. Of course, the Tahawi is so beautiful. It's largely a narration of the opinions of Abu Hanifa, as he himself puts in the beginning. Allah. It affirms the reality of Allah's existing outside of time. There's no beginning to Allah's existence. He exists. His existence تقدمت كل الكائنات حديثها. Right? His reality precedes all created things. And His existence transcends any ending. That's His baqa, right? But His beginninglessness is not a succession of moments. nor, because that's originated, right? That's originated. And those who think mathematically would conceive of that in mathematical terms, like because there's a relative eternity, forward or backwards. That's not what we're talking about. It's absolute eternity. It doesn't enter into number. And likewise going forward, right? Whereas so Allah's existence is not a succession of moments. He is the creator of all moments. Moments do not relate to Allah. So everything is, there's no before, now, and after with respect to Allah. That relates to creation, does not relate to the creator. You find it? Ayn al-Qudat al-Hamadani? Maybe it'll come up when it starts. Qidam and Baqa. So he said, وَلَا يَجْرِي عَلَيْهِ زَمَانٍ وَلَيْسَ لَهُ جِهَةٌ مِنَ الْجِهَاتِ السِّتِّ وَلَا هُوَ فِي جِهَةٍ مِنْهَا. He does not have a direction of the 6 directions. And he is not in any of those directions. As Imam Tahawi says, لا تحويه الجهات الست. Right? الطحاوي لا تحويه الجهات الست. And of course, if you want to entertain yourselves a little bit, because ironically, many of our attitudinally divergent brethren and their scholars have sort of renewed interest in the last century in the Aqeedah Tahawiyya. They publish it, but it sort of serves as a strong witness against them, and then they twist and turn to explain it, right? Because all of these are absurd to affirm for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you affirmed it literally, if the universe is like this, if Allah was above the universe, then relative to us, if he was above, then what happens to the people in Australia? Is he below them? Right? And it entails all kinds of absurdities, right? Unless you say somehow creation is inside Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It attains all kinds of absurdities. And this is why does he repeat certain affirmations? The commentator mentioned this is in Bab al-Mubalagha fi tanzih. This is emphasizing the transcendence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says, وَلَا يَجِبُ عَلَيْهِ شَيْءٍ. And nothing is necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And this is a refutation in the Islamic tradition of the Mu'tazila, who said that يَجِبُ عَلَى اللَّهِ فِعْلُ الصَّلَاحِ وَالْأَصْلَحِ. That Allah must do the good or that which is better. There's 2 goods, he must. Firstly, because what is good? Right? Good arises only when in a relationship between 2 where one has rights over you and you fulfill the right, or you go beyond the basic fulfillment of the right. So that's as-salah or the aslah. What's the problem that arises in conceiving of that? So for example, if I borrowed $1,000 from Zubair, I did good to him by paying him back. Right? Not paying him back would be bad, because I owe him a right. Fulfilling the right is good, and fulfilling it in a better way, so I repaid early, etc., that's better. Right? But good and bad only arise when there are rights and responsibilities between the different parties. But the Creator and creation, does the Creator owe anything to the creation? No. He created them out of nothing. That their very existence is an absolute debt they owe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So they have no claim upon Allah. Right? So good and bad only arise with respect to the choices of those morally responsible. Right? Who owe rights and responsibilities. Right? Allah is munazzah from that. Right? Right? That's why, right? So Allah does not have to be gentle with any particular person. Allah doesn't have to do what's better for a person. Right? Whether in their dunya or their deen. Right? Now, right? So he tells, now, Imam al-Khadimi and the later Maturidis often took a middle course between the Maturidis and the Ash'aris, right? So, certainly intrinsically, in of itself, Allah, God, insofar as He is God, is not required to reward the obedient or to punish the sinner. But so what's mentioned here in the commentary, this is in of itself. نظرا إلى إرادته وقدرته فحسب. Just looking at the reality of Allah's will and power just per se. Because we'll see the issue, there's more to the issue in a moment. But in itself, and that's why there isn't a difference between the Ash'aris and Maturidis in itself, right, on this issue. So I have a friend, well, according to Ambrose Bierce, he'd be considered an acquaintance, right? Because the Devil's Dictionary, he defined a friend is someone you'd borrow money from and lend money to. But an acquaintance is someone you would borrow money from but never lend money to. But anyways, he called me, and his wife's a student of knowledge too. Says, I think my wife's a kafir. The uncle Rabbani within me wanted to say, if one of you is a kafir, it would be you, not her. Because she's a much smarter person and has studied a lot more and a lot more serious than he is. It had to do with one of these issues. Because the Maturidis looked at, well, Allah is also wise, and we'll see the notion of the wisdom of God in a moment, etc. So He wouldn't do certain things. Not because it's outside of His will and power, but given what we know about Allah and His attributes, they're all necessary for God, He would not do that. Right? But the difference between Ahl Sunnah, the Ash'aris and the Maturidis, is that it is within Allah's will and power intrinsically to punish the obedient and reward the sinner. It's up to Him. Right? Let's say Auntie Jamila made a cake. And she didn't give me any. Can I complain? I was standing in line. Did she say there's a line? No. She just made a cake. I decided to stand in line. And she just gave it to the sisters. How come we didn't get any? Do you have a claim on the cake? No. Right? He created you. That's in itself. But this is, of course, all not considering the reality of the divine promise, the divine threat, etc., and of what we know of Allah's mercy, His justice, His wisdom, etc. But that's where the Ash'aris and Maturidis define some of these attributes slightly differently. But the Ash'aris and Maturidis do not differ, that this is intrinsically within the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's how we understand what's in the commentary here. Just to be aware. So it needs to be for what Allama al-Khadimi rahmatullahi alayhi, is a great muhaqqiq, mentioned, this is في حد ذاته, in of itself. Okay. That's why, and this, of course, the origin of what this is mentioned is taken from Allama Sa'd al-Din al-Taftazani. He says, لا يجب عليه شيء, nothing is required for Allah, right? وإلا لما خلق, says لما خلق الكافر الفقير المعذب في الدنيا والآخرة. Nothing is required for Allah, because otherwise He would not have created the disbeliever who is poor and who's tormented in this life and tormented in the next, right? Right? So he says ثواب المطيع فضل, right? ودليله الطاعة. He quotes here from شرح الطوالع, right? طوالع الأنوار في البيضاوي. يعني ثواب المطيع فضل ودليله الطاعة وعقاب العصاة عدل ودليله العصيان. So the reward of the obedience is from Allah's grace, His bounty, His fadl. Its indicator is obedience. And the punishment of the sinner is Allah's justice. Its indicator is disobedience. Okay? So what does it say in Jawhar al-Tawheed? فإن يثب فبمحض الفضل وإن يثبنا. So the author of Jawhar al-Tawheed said, إن يثبنا فبمحض الفضل. If He rewards us, it is His pure largesse, His pure favor. And if He punishes us, it is nothing but justice. Because He's laid out. If you do this, He's laid it out. And then, of course, He also mentions, وَمَنْ يَمُتْ وَلَمْ يَتُبْ مِنْ ذَنْبِهِ فَأَمْرُهُ مُفَوَّضٌ لِرَبِّهِ. Whoever dies not having repented from their sins, their matter is consigned to their Lord. If He punishes us, that is but justice. And if He forgives, that is from His mercy. Okay. وَلَا يَحُلُّ فِيهِ حَادِث. No originated thing subsists in Him. Right? Because, and there's a rational proof for this, because لازم الحادث حادث, because anything that's inseparable from the originated is also originated. Right? And if you conceive of there being this bubble, that is الوجود الحادث, and Allah does not exist in that, and He does not exist outside of that. He is transcendent beyond time and place. Right? Now, any hadith, where is it? It's within that bubble, so to speak. Right? That bubble, that is time and space and all that is within it. So, how could that thing that is bound by time and space, and all origination is bound by it, how could it be connected to that which is beyond time? There's no relationship to time and space. There's no point of connection. Right? Hakim. لا يفعل شيئا إلا بحكمة. Right? Wise. He does nothing except with wisdom. Right? And this is one of the sensitive issues. Actually has a lot of legal implications too. Because law reflects theology. Right? And in many ways it can be said that the Ash'ari school is sort of like the Shafi'i school when it comes to matters of theology. Right? Its interpretive approach and its understanding approach. And so what is wisdom? Right? On one side you had the literalists who mumbled and said all kinds of ridiculous things. That if Allah wanted to do something foolish, He would do it. And that's absurd. Right? Because firstly, just absurdity, because folly is something Allah is transcendent beyond anyways. Right? And there is and one of the hadiths that touch upon wisdom, that is one of the central hadiths of our deen, they have to do with dhulm, with wrongdoing, right? يا عبادي إني حرمت الظلم على نفسي فلا تظالموا. And this is a very blessed hadith, because this hadith مسلسل بالدمشقيين. Why? Because who's the narrator of the hadith? Who's the narrator of the hadith? Is it Abu Darda? Just double check. يا عبادي إني حرمت الظلم على نفسي فلا تظالموا. Anyways, so my servants, I have forbidden wrongdoing for myself, so do not wrong one another. Right? And this is where one of the great hadith commentators, one of the great author, probably the greatest commentary on the Arba'in Nawawi, but it's important just to make this a point because it's subtle but significant. And it was first pointed out to me by Shaykh Talal al-Ahdab, Allah protect and preserve him. I had no clue what he's talking about. None. But I'd made notes on it. And I forgot about it for a long time. Once in a while I'd wonder about it. Yeah, Shaykh Talal said something about this. There's an issue there. But I forgot what it was. But I still had my notes. I went back. He didn't actually explain it much. He just said there's a problem there. It's important to take what one's teachers say seriously. Much later, I was looking at the issue again and I consulted and read about it. Okay. So so there's an issue there because the implications of what, and alhamdulillah, most people pay no attention to anything, so it's like it all goes above their heads, alhamdulillah. But the way Ibn Rajab expresses the issue would make it appear as if dhulm is possible for Allah, but He's chosen not to engage in dhulm, right? But that is a slip that entered into his what he relates to us from Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, who erred on this point. The position of Ahl Sunnah is that dhulm, wrongdoing, is intrinsically absurd to conceive of for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because dhulm is to not give another what is rightfully theirs. Either by falling short in giving them what's rightfully theirs, or by demanding more than what's rightfully yours from them. right? And both are absurd to conceive of for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So dhulm is absolutely absurd intrinsically with respect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the ulama, sometimes people feel that they get sticklers for these kinds of things in the old days, and that's why over lunch Shaykh Birgivi and I were discussing, in many a Muslim land, even places where there would be a lot of ulama, they standardize the khutbahs. They would just read from historical books of khutbahs. But why? So because if any random person gets up and gives a khutbah, they're going to say a lot of things that words have levels of indication. Sometimes even the subtle indications of something affect people's consciousness, and they shake people's faith, and they can lead people astray. Right? Now, most people don't think, but someone may think about something, and that's why the Prophet ﷺ used to seek refuge and adilla aw udal, right? Of misguiding someone else or being misguided by them. And he's teaching us. Why? Because a believer would not misguide another deliberately, but the implications of what you say and its indications could. So anyways, Hakim, right? Hakim is a wasfu mubalagha. Hakim is like alim, this fa'il pattern, right? So it is kathirul. So it's the one it goes back to the hukm of Allah, right? بمعنى وصف مبالغة. He is Hakim. He is the one who judges. He is the absolute judge, Hakim, or whose judgment is, or whose affirmation is al-mutqin, right? So it either goes back to Hakim, Hakim is the one whose judgment is absolute, is absoluteness of judgment, or perfection of judgment, right? Or the one whose knowledge is perfected, right? So hikmah goes back to the perfection of knowledge, will, and power. Hikmah goes back to the perfection of knowledge, will, and power, right? لا يفعل شيئا إلا بحكمة. He does nothing except with wisdom. What is wisdom? With absolute knowledge, with absolute and perfect knowledge, absolute and perfect will, and absolute and perfect power. Right? Right? So this is why Mawlana Al-Khadimi relates from the mufradat of Raghib, right? This is sort of who's an imam of the Ash'aris, of course. الحكمة من الله تعالى معرفة الأشياء وإيجادها على غاية الإحكام. Right? Wisdom from Allah Most High is to have complete knowledge of all things, right? And to originate them with completeness of perfection, right? So wisdom with respect to Allah is the absolute encompassingness and perfection of His knowledge, of His power, of His will and His power. So anything that is originated is a manifestation of the perfectedness of Allah's knowledge, of His will and His power. Right? And Mawlana Al-Khadimi then goes into, and that's a useful definition to know. That's why he mentions it first. Mawlana al-Khadimi here goes into the difference of opinion between the Ash'aris and Maturidis on hikmah. You can read it there, page 16, right? Or at least put a foot, like in the margins. Al-Khilaf fi mafhum al-hikmah, right? Or right? And it's a useful discussion. You can read it there. We won't. Right? So the Ash'aris were absolutists. They wouldn't say more than wisdom being the perfection of knowledge, will, and power. Does Allah act out of wisdom? They would not say things like that. They would say Allah's actions manifest wisdom. Wisdom is an inherent quality of the divine. It is manifest in anything that He wills. It is manifest in His knowledge. It's manifest in His specification with His will, and in His origination with His power. We're not going to say more than that. The Maturidis would say no, right? That Allah's actions are connected with tangible wisdoms and benefits. So it's sort of an intermediate position between the Ash'aris and the Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila says Allah must do. So His will and power are limited. Allah can't do whatever He wills. He must do the good. Ash'ari said Allah could do whatever He wants. Like He could put every righteous person in hell and let them burn forever. No one to ask Him anything. Of course, He promised that it's contingently absurd because Allah has promised us otherwise. The Maturidis would say, yes, we agree with you that this could happen, insofar as it relates to the will and power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in of itself. But effectively, Allah's, some of them refer to it, هذا يدخل دخولا أوليا في قدرته في إرادته وقدرته. That this is intrinsically within Allah's will and power. But given that He is wise and just and merciful, He would not do that. So His actions are, so they say وَيَخْرُجْ عَنْهَا خُرُوجًا ثَانِيًا, that it's intrinsically within Allah's will and power, right? So it's like with no comparison. Let's say Zubair comes and sits down next to you. Zubair does kickboxing, right? So could Zubair pummel you till you're dead? But would Zubair do that? Why? Because while that's within the ability and power of Zubair, because he is a world champion, a kickboxer, but he is also kind and caring, etc. So is it conceivable that he'd do that? No. Right? It's like if you have a housemate, could they come at night and take a butcher's knife and slaughter you? Could they? It's within their will and power. But would they do it? No, don't be scared at night. But would they do it? No, because what we know of the other attributes. So that's not affirming incapacity. That's within the will and power, but he would not act this way given what else we affirm necessarily about him. That's what the Maturidis say. And we're going to respect the Sayyid al-Maturidiyya in this class, just insofar as it's their text. Birgivi is very much a Maturidi. That's why he puts this, Hakim la yaf'al shay illa bihikmah. Right? But not because his actions are limited by wisdom, but they inherently manifest wisdom, right? So in that sense, right? And there's a little bit of discussion on that in the commentary. We won't go into more than that, right? Right? لِحِكْمَةٍ وَفَائِدَةٍ, and a benefit, right? Out of a wisdom and a benefit. Now, of course, the wisdoms and benefits, so Allah does things out of wisdoms and benefits. These manifest the perfection of His knowledge, will, and power, right? Now, what we know from that is, it's like what Allah tells us, وَمَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا, you do not create this in vain. So even the worst of things manifest a wisdom and a benefit. What's the wisdom and benefit? We may be able to discern it, we may not be able to discern it. The wisdom and benefit may be worldly or next worldly. So let's say, so for example, of course this does not mean that we're passive, because knowing that Allah's actions manifest wisdom is a matter of faith, but it's a matter of responsibility. So is the fact that masajid have been ransacked and burnt in Delhi and elsewhere, right, in the last few days, right, that Muslim businesses have been burnt down, dozens of Muslims have been slaughtered, is there wisdom in that? Yes. What's the status of those who died? What happens to them? They're martyrs. Did they lose out? لا. Right? أحياء عند ربهم يرزقون. Right? Alive with their Lord, provided for. Right? فرحين, rejoicing. Right? With all that their Lord has granted them. Right? So, but that may not be manifest to us, except with the light of Iman and tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But it is only the one who looks with the eye of faith who can see the wisdom in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation, right? Because even the kafir manifests divine wisdom, right? Everything manifests the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the names and attributes of Allah and their implications. Right? One of my mentors, I lived down the road from him, Shaykh Ashraf Munib. He was going with his wife, who's an American citizen, for a couple of months to the US. So I was going to because if he really knew me, he would never give me his key. But I was too much in awe of him. I had a lot of crazy ideas. Like, he had a much bigger house than mine. We could kind of chill out here. There's too much else to do while in Damascus to actually muck around, but I had a lot of thoughts. But he gave me his key for the time. So we'd go, whatever we're supposed to. I didn't do anything. I just gave it to my wife. So I was just he was packing up. I was sort of helping out or getting in the way. I said, Sayyidi, isn't it hard on the heart to be in a non-Muslim land surrounded by kuffar? I was like 23 at the time, kind of just shooting the breeze. And he looked at me like, I just don't get it, but very kindly. I said, why? So, because here you're in a beautiful environment, there's believers around, and the adhan and so on. So he just smiled and said, anyone who has even the slightest of light of Iman in their heart would behold the manifestation of Allah's names and attributes in all that is around. هذا خلق الله, this is the creating of Allah. It all manifests Allah's attributes. You see someone who's a disbeliever, someone who's corrupt, you see Allah's manifestation of the name, the one who guides, the one who honors, the one who, and they're opposite. له الكون مرآة ومظهر الصفات. Right? Creation is a mirror for the attributes of its creator. And there's a wisdom. That's a metaphysical wisdom. But there's also a wisdom with respect to his creation. Right? فعال لما يشاء بلا إيجاب. He does whatsoever he wishes without any obligation. Right? So this is affirming the middle ground, right? That Allah's actions manifest wisdom, but He does whatsoever He wishes, and there's nothing to limit Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are three very careful affirmations, and it's good to know, and these are things important to convey. Because sometimes people convey, Allah does whatever He wants. So some people conceive of Allah that somehow He's a random bully. Right? Some people's sense of God, what if Allah punishes me? What if this? What if He, I was with somebody yesterday and they're like, what if when I praise Allah, I'm just showing off and He punishes me for that? Right? So this conceiving of Allah somehow is like He's going to bully you, So no. Bila ijab. And then He says, munazzahun an sifatin nuqsan, transcendent beyond all attributes of imperfection. Because He is God. Right? Because He is the necessary existent. Because He is beyond all limits relate to that which is originated. Limit is absurd to conceive of for something that is wajib. Wujuban dhatiyan, that's intrinsically necessary. Right? So munazzah, transcendent from all attributes of imperfection, absolutely. متصف بصفات الكمال كلها, characterized by all attributes of perfection, completely. Right? وليس له كمال متوقع, and He has no perfection that is awaited. Why? That someone saying, well, I'm studying right now, I'll become a scholar. I'm doing this right now, one day I'll become good at baking. Someone says, well, I'm striving to be of the muttaqeen. No. Allah has له معنى الخالق ولا مخلوق, as Al-Tahawi says. He has the meanings of the creator even when there's no creation. وله معنى الرازق ولا مرزوق. He has the meaning of the provider even though there's nothing to provide for, etc. He did not acquire any meaning of perfection upon creating that He does not already possess, quote unquote, before creating. Of course, before creating is only relative to us. It does not relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then He says, azaliyun. Right, we'll stop at azali and pray bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Those brothers were just praying here? They're just praying here? Alhamdulillah. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi. To continue our lesson, so we looked briefly at wisdom, right? So everything that Allah does manifests benefit and manifests benefit and wisdom, right? We may be able to discern that, or we might not. But it's not necessarily in the individual interest of any given person in of themselves, right? That's counterfactual, right? Because people suffer and all kinds of things happen, right? But it ultimately serves a wisdom. And in all of it was the possibility of benefit for the individual, because human beings have been created with choice. Right? They have their irada, they have their will. So even in the worst of disasters, right? Had the person responded in accordance with what is pleasing to Allah, that is for their eternal good. As one of the poets said, وَتَلَافِي إِن كَانَ فِيهِ ائْتِلَافِي عَجِّلْ بِهِ جُعِلْتُ فِدَاكَ. Talafi, my complete ruin, if it were the means of being with you, then hasten it, for I am all yours, right? So, so in that sense, nothing that befalls the person of faith, if they respond with faith, is to their harm. The possibility of mercy envelops everything, if one responds in accordance with how Allah's mercy is attained in any situation. Then he says, azaliyun, right? What is azali? Eternal, right? But there's two things, azal and abad, right? Azal is that which is so he says he's azali and abadi, right? He is eternal without beginning and eternal without end, right? And these are both, his being azali and abadi relate to how his existence relates to the existence of created things, that there is no beginning or end to his existence, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Did you find the quote here? Azali and abadi? Right? And then there's at least three main positions of the relationships between al-qadim and the azali. Qadim, which is another meaning for the eternal, and azali, and some distinguished between the two. But Imam al-Bajuri in his Hashiyat al-Sanusiyya says they're practically they're broadly synonymous, azali and qadim. And likewise, baqa and in his being baqi and his being abadi, his being eternal without end, right? These are essentially synonymous. Some differentiated between them, and these are particular terminologies. Ayn al-Qudat, does he come up here? Ayn al-Qudat al-Hamadani, azali, abadi. Okay. Is it Dur al-Mubaha online? Okay, anyways, Bismillah. Right? So he's ancient without beginning and eternal without end. So that's why, what does, right in the beginning of the Tahawi says, قديم بلا ابتداء دائم بلا انتهاء لا يفنى ولا يبيد ولا يكون إلا ما يريد. Right? This is revolving around the same ocean of meanings as the Tahawiyya. Right? قديم بلا ابتداء, that's أزلي, ancient without beginning. أبدي دائم بلا انتهاء, eternal without end. Right? But they're both aspects of the same reality as we've mentioned. Right? Right? Just give it to me. Alhamdulillah. Yeah. Right? So, Shaykh Abdul Ghani Nabulsi says, there's page 252 of Al-Hadiqatu Nadiyya. Shaykh Abdul Ghani has these paradisical names for his books. Right? So his commentary on the Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya is called Al-Hadiqatu Nadiyya. The garden moist with the morning dew. Nada, right? The garden that is moist with the morning dew. So it's the most beautiful when a garden is. Al-Hadiqatu Nadiyya fi Sharh al-Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya. Okay? His commentary on Risalat al-Tawheed of Shaykh Wali Raslan, it's called Khamratul Han wa Rannatul Alhan, the wine of the tavern and the sweet sound of beautiful tunes. في شرح رسالة الشيخ ولي رسلان. Right? He has some beautiful, beautiful names of his books. Anyways, he says, وفي زبدة الحقائق لعين القضاة الهمداني قدس الله سره. Right? In this work by عين القضاة الهمداني, ومن ظن الأزلية شيء ماض فقد أخطأ خطأ فاحشا. Whoever imagines that his being eternal without beginning is something related to the past has made a tremendous error. فحيث الأزلية فلا ماضي ولا مستقبل. Because wherever there is eternity, there is no past and there is no future. وهي محيطة بالزمن المستقبل كإحاطتها بالزمن الماضي من غير فرق. Because this meaning of eternity encompasses both future time, just as it encompasses all past time, without distinction. فليس زمن آدم عليه السلام أقرب بالأزلية من زماننا. So the time of Adam, peace be upon him, is not closer to eternity than our time right now. بل نسبة الأزمنة كلها إلى الأزلية واحدة. Rather, the relationship of eternity to all times is the same. Right? And then he goes into an extensive discussion on this. Right? Right? فاعلم أنه لا, then he says, فاعلم. So he says, فإذا فهمت هذه المعاني. So if you understand this reality, that Allah's eternity is not, His qadim is not beforeness and His baqa is not afterness. Right? So he says, فإذا علمت هذه المعاني, if you understand these meanings, فاعلم أنه لا مغايرة بين الأزلية والأبدية. There's no real difference between His ancientness and His endlessness. في المعنى أصلا, in meaning, in what any way whatsoever. بل إذا اعتبر وجود ذلك المعنى مع نسبته إلى الماضي. Rather, if you consider this meaning and consider its existence with respect to our past, of past times, meaning past, originated times, استعير له لفظة الأزلية. Then we refer to the absolute eternity of Allah as أزلية, as ancientness. وإن اعتبر وجوده مع نسبته إلى المستقبل, if we consider the existence of Allah's absolute eternity and consider it with respect to the future, in created time, we would refer to Allah's eternity as abadi, or as baqa, as everlastingness. انتهى. So these are the words of عين القضاة الحمداني. Sidi Abdul Ghani Nabulsi rahimahullah says, وهذا الكلام في أعلى طبقات التحقيق. These words are at the highest stations of verification. ولا يشعر به إلا أهل العناية والتوفيق. And no one feels this meaning except the people of divine concern and facilitation. Okay? رضي الله تعالى عنه. He said, Shaykh Abdul Ghani رضي الله تعالى عنه. So this is a fa'idah, which is quoted in summary by Shaykh Muhammad Sa'id al-Burhani, either in his footnotes on the Hadiyya al-Ala'iyya, or in his notes on the Durar al-Mubaha fi al-Hadr wal-Ibaha. And sometimes you have to be careful whose footnotes you're looking at, but the footnotes of the great scholars are often precious. They say قد يوجد في النهر ما لا يوجد في البحر. You may find in rivers what you don't find in oceans. Right? Of course, the origin of the expression that you may find in rivers what you don't find in oceans is one of the great imams of the Arabic language, Abu Hayyan. He wrote a tafsir called Al-Bahr al-Madid, Al-Bahr al-Muhit, the encompassing ocean. He's a brilliant imam of the Arabic language. And he goes on and on and on about brilliant lexical discussions. But people said this is so beneficial, but it's so lost. There's multiple PhD theses just on the linguistic expressions and discussions in Al-Bahr al-Muhit. Some actually just took all the grammatical discussions in it, and it's at least 2-volume book. So he said, could you abridge this for us? So he wrote an abridged tafsir called An-Nahru al-Mad min al-Bahr al-Muhit, the river that flows out from the encompassing ocean. But as he was abridging it, more tafsiri thoughts occurred to him. So he put them in his Nahr al-Mad, in the river that flows forth from the encompassing ocean. So it is said that that's where this very famous expression came. قد يوجد في البحر ما لا قد يوجد في النهر ما لا يوجد في البحر. One may find in rivers what one does not find in oceans. Wallahu a'lam. So don't miss out on this fact. It's there on. Maybe someone could just. What we'll do, we'll take a picture of it too, and post it. Maybe highlight it and then take a picture with a nice title to it. Any. One of the sort of the intelligent slackers things that if you save images of something, write down in the image of the PDF itself what book it's from. Right? Because you won't have to decipher it later. Because 10 years from now, you might not remember it. And it's really good to put it in the title itself. Just takes 10 seconds extra. So you put, like, معنى الأزلي والأبدي في حق الله تعالى كلام الهمداني. Right? And you put من شرح الطريقة المحمدية. Right? You can put that just in the title, so then later if you're looking for it, you'll find it. Okay. So then he says, له صفات قديمة. He has eternal attributes. Right? So Allah, right? So the divine, Allah Most High, right? They say, لفظ الجلالة الله علم على الذات الواجب الوجود. Right? The divine name Allah is a personal name of the entity that is the necessary existent, المتصف المتصف بجميع صفات الكمال, that is characterized by all attributes of perfection. المنزه عن جميع صفات النقصان, transcendent beyond all qualities of imperfection. Right? So here, of course, there's an objection that's a bit, and they got themselves into it for intellectual reasons, but quite simply, the Mu'tazila said Allah is eternal. He is knowing, willing, powerful, etc. He does not have eternal attributes called knowledge, will, and power. Because he said that if he's an eternal entity and there are eternal attributes, you have affirmed multiple eternals. أثبتت تعدد القدماء. And they would sort of scoff Ahl Sunnah that at least the Christians only said there's three eternals. They affirm the Trinity. You have affirmed an infinity of eternals. They said, no. We are affirming one eternal entity that it itself is characterized by multiple eternal attributes. Right? Is your knowledge other than you? No. So I say, if we said, we won't praise you, Zubair is intelligent and powerful and thoughtful, how many people are we talking about? One. Because one entity that has many attributes, it is still one entity. Right? That's very straightforward. Of course, it comes back to, so له صفات قديمة. Right? He has eternal attributes. قائمة بذاته, that subsist through the entity of Allah. Right? لا هو ولا غيره. The attributes are not Allah Himself and they're not other than Allah. Right? So is your intelligence you? No. Right? But is it other than you? No. That's why Imam Laqani put it very eloquently in Jawhar al-Tawheed. ثم صفات الذات ليست بعين ولا بغير الذات. Correct? What did he say? You know it. You haven't memorized it? You have a race here. Who's going to memorize the Jawhara? ثم صفات الذات ليست بعين ولا بغير الذات. Okay, anyways, so the attributes of Allah's entity are not the entity itself. Just think of Zayd. Is his intelligence Zayd himself? No. But it's not other than him, right? Such that you can conceive of Zayd without conceiving of his intelligence. But his intelligence And you can think of intelligence without thinking of Zayd. But can you think of Zayd's intelligence existing actually without Zayd? No. Because الصفة لا تقوم إلا بموصوف. Because an attribute only exists through something that is an attribute of. Right? So they're not Allah Himself and they're not other than Allah Most High. Right? And there's reasons why they mention this. Right? But there is a practical implication of this for us, which is that when we reflect, right? So we have the attributes of Allah and we have the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah describes Himself to us by His names. Each of the names, each of the asma point to an attribute possessed by Allah, by the divine entity, right? So what is Al-Hakim? Al-Hakim is Allah, the one characterized by the attribute of hikmah, right? So when we read the Quran, Huwa Ar-Rahman, who is Ar-Rahman? It is Allah. Right? So the names point to the one named and highlight one of the attributes of the one named. Right? But is the merciful not also the majestic and mighty and powerful, etc.? Yes. Right? Because every name in the Quran, like who is Al-Latif? Right? Al-Latif, the name, the gentle, it's pointing to Allah, the one, highlighting His quality of lutf, of gentleness. But the one who has this highlighted quality of gentleness, He is the same one who has all the other names and attributes. Which of course, when we think about Allah's rahmah, that's why Allah reminds us of Himself by His names much more than by His attributes. Right? وَهُوَ الْغَفُورُ. And Allah is the all-forgiving and most merciful. Why? They say one of the wisdoms in this is so that when we consider the attributes of Jalal, we don't forget the attributes of Jamal. The attributes of might, we don't forget the attributes of mercy. And vice versa, Huwa al-Ghafur Rahim, He's the all, so you're not just, because if He said, if we just thought about the attribute itself, we may forget the one who their characteristics of. Who is Al-Ghafur? Allah. Because the name points to the one named, highlighting this attribute. But all the other attributes are there. What's this? قُلْ ادْعُوا اللَّهَ أَوْ ادْعُوا الرَّحْمَنِ. Call upon Allah or call upon the All-Merciful. فَأَيَّمَّا تَدْعُوا. Whichever you call upon, فَلَهُ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى. Whichever name you call Him by, His are all the most beautiful names. Right? And there's a tremendous divine wisdom in that. In how Allah tells us about Himself in the Quran. So He's going to tell us about the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some of the discussions here in Khadimi, they're technical. Don't get lost in them. Right? There's no inherent merit in reading everything in every commentary. Because, right? And then he goes through the attributes. We'll begin next class by looking. So he says, وَهِيَ الْحَيَاةُ هِيَ الْحَيَاةُ وَالْعِلْمُ وَالْقُدْرَةُ, etc. Here, we will highlight, بإذن الله, one of the important things to consider is what do we mean by an attribute, a sifa, right? Because here, sifat, sifa, an attribute, an attribute has two usages, right? In English, an attribute, one, right, is a sifa, is ma yusafu bihi shay. Something, an attribute is a meaning attributed to another. So anything attributed to another can be called an attribute, insofar as it's attributed to him. Right? So you say, who made the cake? Say, Yaqub made the cake. So the making of the cake was attributed to Yaqub. Now, is making cake an attribute of Yaqub? Right, so attribute has two meanings, right? One is that which is attributed to another. مَا يُوصَفُ بِهِ الشَّيْء. That's a general sense of the word attribute. The other meaning of an attribute in general is a quality that an entity possesses. So, if someone made a cake once, would you say they are a baker? No. Right? Because there's a certain threshold of meaning that if found, you would call someone a baker. Someone wrote a book, would you call them a writer? No. Right? So, but an attribute when ascribed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And we talked about this idea of His eternity, etc. An attribute in the technical sense is a meaning that Allah eternally possesses. Right? The reason this is important to appreciate before we get into the specific discussions next week is, and this actually, some of these statements are affirmed from Imam Abu Hanifa himself, like he has half a dozen treatises on belief, on Aqeedah, ascribed to him, which are either authored by him or transmitted by him or derived from his teachings by his students, that there's a number of things that Imam Abu Hanifa himself and some of the early Muslims refer to as being his sifa. But this is in the general sense. For example, is istiwa a sifa of Allah? Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arsh istawa. The All-Merciful is established on the throne. Is it a sifa? Yes or no? It's not. That's not completely sound. Someone should be able to get it.
It is according to the first definition, something attributed to Allah.
Yeah, so it's a sifa, وصف الله نفسه بالاستواء. Allah attributed istiwa to himself. But is istiwa an eternal attribute of Allah? That'd be absurd. Because if istiwa were an eternal attribute, then it would entail that the throne, there has to be a throne there in eternity. And how can a created thing be eternal? Right? It's absurd. Right? Rather, istiwa fi'lun min af'alihi. It's an action of Allah's actions. Right? Or ma'nan adaf Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ila nafsi. And we'll see how it's understood, but it's certainly not an eternal attribute in relation to the throne, because it would entail حوادث لا أول لها, originated things that have no beginning, which is absurd. And even if you affirmed beginningless things, originated things that have no beginning, that's still relative eternity, and Allah's eternity is absolute. So it entails the absurd. And likewise, other things. Some of the Salaf said that Allah, lahu yadun huwa hiya sifat, or things like this, which the later scholars avoided these expressions because they can confuse people. But all of that is wasaf Allah nafsahu biha. Khalas. That's it. And that's a very useful distinction to make. We'll look at some of the formal definitions the ulama give for what is a sifa in its technical usage of the theologians, meaning a ma'nan. And then of course, but then the ulama distinguish between different types of attributes. And they talk about, in one level they talk about the personal attribute, the negative attributes, and the affirmative attributes. Talk about sifat al-thubutiyya, sifat al-dhatiyya, the number of ways they classified the attributes. But we'll look at that a little bit. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.